On the morning of the 19th of February 2026, his 66th birthday, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was arrested by British police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. No longer a prince in title, stripped of his dukedom the previous October, he stood at the threshold of criminal proceedings that a decade earlier would have been unthinkable for a son of the British crown. The charge traces to a single email, sent on Christmas Eve 2010, buried in millions of unsealed United States Department of Justice files, in which Andrew forwarded a confidential government briefing on reconstruction investment in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, to Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender. A man Andrew had publicly claimed he'd broken contact with weeks earlier. That arrest didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was the endpoint of a 30-year institutional failure, a palace that saw the warning signs, recorded them, and then quietly filed them away. Former staff, royal protection officers, and senior diplomats all watched the same man exhibit the same pattern of reckless entitlement for 3 decades. Most said nothing. Many were prevented from saying anything at all. The thesis of this story is simple. The British monarchy didn't just fail to stop Prince Andrew. It actively shielded him, stage by stage, decade by decade, until the thing it was protecting him from became the thing it could no longer survive. Start with Charlotte Briggs. She worked as a maid at the palace during the mid-1990s, and on her first day, she was given a full day's training on a single task, the precise arrangement of Andrew's stuffed toys. He maintained 72 of them on his bed, sorted by size, with specific positioning requirements that staff were drilled to memorize. As soon as I got the job, Briggs recalled, I was told about the teddies, and it was drilled into me how he wanted them. That detail is more than absurd. It's diagnostic. The palace didn't just tolerate that demand. It institutionalized the compliance. Someone wrote the training briefing. Someone delivered it. Someone decided that was a normal use of household staff time. That is a system that has already decided one man's comfort is worth everyone else's labor and silence. The nickname Randy Andy arrived even earlier. By May 1978, the Evening News was reporting that Andrew had acquired it during his time at Gordonston, the same school his father and elder brother had attended, owing to a string of romantic entanglements that made him notable even at 18. A former housemaster there, speaking to author Andrew Lowney, was more direct. All I had heard about Andrew, he said, was that he was a bully. One woman who knew him during those years described him as a very slimy so-and-so, arrogant, pleased with himself, a bully, adding, he thinks he's funny, handsome, and clever, and he isn't. These are school-era assessments. The people delivering them weren't courtiers protecting reputations. They were simply people who had met him. By the 1990s, the assessments from people who worked around him professionally were no gentler. Journalist John Arledge described Andrew as the most arrogant and thoughtless public figure I have ever interviewed. Valentine Lowe, in his book Courtiers, characterized him as rude, gauche, insensitive, and wholly unaware of other people. Tina Brown, who spent years building the palace papers from more than 100 sources, many too embedded in royal circles to be named, distilled it to this. He's clearly a dim bulb. There's very little going on upstairs, and he's something of an oaf. He certainly has no clue how he comes off in the world. Unfortunately, being intellectually dim and surrounded by sycophancy is a very bad combination. That sycophancy had a source, and Brown names it directly. Queen Elizabeth II was Andrew's mother, which is a fact so obvious it obscures what it actually means in this context. In the institutional structure of the British monarchy, the sovereign is also the head of the household, the ultimate authority over who is protected and who is cut loose. When those two roles converge in a single person who also happens to love the problem unconditionally, The result is what Brown documents in clinical detail. He was her favorite, Brown told the New York Times. She protected him, and Mommy was his only client, essentially. Because the Queen enabled Andrew in a really terrible way. Brown didn't hedge that assessment. The fact is that she has quite a lot to answer for with Andrew is the truth. She's vulnerable to her children's influence. This is why she needs to have a private secretary with her when she makes those kinds of decisions, because she's also a mother. The Queen reportedly told a close friend, in a line that captures the entire dynamic in 9 words, "You have to remember, he is my son." As a structural matter, that sentence explains everything that follows. When concerns reached the palace about Andrew's conduct, his rudeness to staff, his questionable associations, his use of royal access for personal benefit, they reached a woman who had already decided, somewhere beneath the institutional obligation, that her son deserved the benefit of the doubt. Every aide who raised a concern was raising it against that backdrop. Every courtier who wanted to move against Andrew knew the final decision rested with a woman who had trained a maid to arrange his teddy bears and called it appropriate household management. The trade envoy appointment, made in September 2001, codified the problem in government letterhead. Andrew was named UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, an unpaid role that came loaded with expenses-funded travel, staff support, diplomatic access, and the implicit authority of the Crown. Former diplomat Simon Wilson, who served as deputy head of the British mission in Bahrain and dealt with Andrew directly during a 2003 mission, described the experience in an ITV documentary with measured disgust. "We had a whole raft of things that came out in advance of his visit. His dislikes in terms of eating and stuff," Wilson recalled. Andrew traveled with a valet, a private secretary, an equerry, a lady clerk, and a business advisor. He demanded water at room temperature, no ice. His nickname among the British diplomatic community in the Gulf wasn't a kind one. Wilson said Andrew was known privately as HBH, His Buffoon Highness. That mockery existed alongside something more serious, the forced falsification of official records. Diplomats posted across the regions where Andrew operated were expected to file positive assessments of his trade missions back to the Foreign Office, regardless of what actually happened on the ground. The gap between what they filed and what they witnessed was, by multiple accounts, significant. The official record was a fiction the institution required them to maintain. Foreign Office documents relating to Andrew's business trips from 2001 to 2011 won't be released until 2065. A 54-year gap between event and disclosure that is itself a structural choice, not an administrative accident. In 2008, a U.S. diplomatic cable from his visit to Kyrgyzstan described him as astonishingly candid. The discussion at times verged on the rude from the British side. He used the visit to attack a serious fraud office investigation into BAE Systems, then went on to denounce these journalists, especially from The Guardian, who poke their noses everywhere. By 2010, Andrew was spending £620,000 per year in his trade envoy capacity, including £154,000 on hotels, food, and hospitality. These were the remarks and the record of a man who had spent a decade being told by diplomatic staff, palace courtiers, and his own mother's institutional silence that his judgment was sound and his position was secure. Jeffrey Epstein arrived in that world in 1999, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell. By June 2000, Epstein was a guest at a party hosted by Queen Elizabeth at Windsor Castle. That December, he joined Andrew for a shooting weekend at Sandringham. Access to Sandringham at Christmas isn't a casual favor. It requires explicit approval from the family. The palace knew who Epstein was before his conviction and welcomed him into its private estates. When Epstein was convicted in 2008 of procuring a minor for prostitution and sentenced to 18 months in an American jail, the obvious institutional response was distance. Andrew maintained proximity. In December 2010, he was photographed walking casually through Central Park with Epstein, just days after Epstein had completed his sentence. When Andrew later gave his account of that meeting to the BBC, he claimed it was specifically to end the friendship in person, face-to-face. What the unsealed DOJ files subsequently showed was that on Christmas Eve of that same month, Andrew emailed Epstein a confidential briefing on investment opportunities in the reconstruction of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And in November 2010, after an official trip to Asia, Andrew forwarded visit reports, briefings initially sent to him by his special advisor, Amit Patel, directly to Epstein's inbox. An email in February 2011, attributed to a member of the British royal family and believed to be Andrew, closed with, "Keep in close touch and we'll play some more soon." The palace's protection officers were present for some of this. Peter Loughborough, commanding Scotland Yard's Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Unit, reportedly supervised the decision permitting elite officers to accept Epstein's hospitality while guarding Andrew during a 2010 trip to the United States, a trip occurring 2 years after Epstein's conviction. A former officer who spoke publicly about the period said, "The big question is what Andrew's protection team witnessed on Epstein Island." He added that there was deep concern among officers about whether raising what they'd seen would cost them their positions. That concern, the calculation between conscience and career, is the mechanism by which 30 years of silence was maintained. Tina Brown, whose sourcing for the Palace Papers runs to more than 100 people, notes that many are so embedded in palace structures that she can't even acknowledge them by name. Palace insiders have since described a wave of worry about what the police investigation might surface, not from people who wanted to protect Andrew, but from people who were terrified of what would happen to them if they had reported what they knew and the palace had decided that was disloyal. By 2011, Andrew stepped down from his trade envoy role under public pressure over his Epstein ties. The palace's position was that contact had been severed. The emails in the DOJ files tell a different story. Virginia Giuffre had been telling her story for years, before institutions were ready to hear it. In a lawsuit filed in 2019, she described being trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell and forced into sexual contact with Andrew on multiple occasions. At Maxwell's London townhouse, at Epstein's Manhattan mansion, and at Epstein's private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. She said she was 16 and 17 years old at the time. Buckingham Palace stated in 2015 that any suggestion of impropriety with underage minors is categorically untrue. Andrew denied the allegations entirely. When Giuffre formally filed her civil lawsuit in August 2021, his legal team prepared to fight it. The settlement came on February 15, 2022. The amount was never officially disclosed, but the Daily Telegraph reported it could reach £12 million, with King Charles, then Prince of Wales, reportedly lending the bulk of the sum to be repaid from the sale of Andrew's Swiss chalet, and with Queen Elizabeth contributing £2 million to Giuffre's sex trafficking charity. On January 12, 2022, a day after Judge Lewis Kaplan refused to dismiss the case, Andrew was stripped of his military affiliations and royal patronages. He was barred from using the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. The weeks of requests from British military organizations that Andrew's honorary titles be returned had finally, quietly, been granted, not by any sudden courage from the institution, but because by then the reputational cost of defending him had finally exceeded the cost of releasing him. Robert Jobson, writing about that period, describes King Charles making urgent calls to his mother, insisting Andrew had to be cut adrift. Elizabeth acted swiftly to protect the monarchy. The two senior courtiers who delivered the decision, the Queen's private secretary Sir Edward Young and Sir Michael Stevens, keeper of the Privy Purse, insisted on being present when the Queen broke the news to Andrew, specifically because they didn't trust the conversation to happen without witnesses. Andrew understandably felt blindsided, Jobson writes, though this was far from her intention. The palace had spent 20 years protecting him. The moment it stopped, it required two senior officials in the room to make sure the message wasn't softened. None of this had to culminate where it did. The BBC Newsnight interview of November 2019 is the clearest demonstration that the palace's protection had crossed into something more damaging than neglect. It had produced a man genuinely incapable of assessing his own situation. The interview was arranged by Sam McAllister, a BBC Newsnight producer, but the decision to do it came from Andrew himself, against the specific advice of palace courtiers who warned him it was a catastrophic idea. He bypassed them. He reportedly told Queen Elizabeth the broadcast would be an opportunity to discuss his entrepreneurial initiatives. She wasn't told he planned to address Epstein on camera. On the 14th of November, 2019, in Buckingham Palace, Andrew sat across from Emily Maitlis and proceeded to deliver the most self-destructive interview by a member of the British royal family in the history of television. He claimed he couldn't have been with Giuffre on the night she described because he had taken his daughter to a Pizza Express in Woking for a birthday party. A detail so specific, it reads as either an alibi or a confession of how thoroughly he had been tracking dates. He stated he was physically incapable of sweating at the time of the alleged encounter due to a medical condition traced to his service in the Falklands, a claim that prompted immediate public skepticism. He said he had no recollection of ever meeting Giuffre, despite a photograph of the two of them together, with Maxwell, circulating in newspapers globally. Asked why he had visited Epstein specifically in December 2010, after the sex conviction, to end the friendship, he said it was because I felt it was the honorable and right thing to do. The phrase honorable and right in that context is telling. It's the language of a man who has spent his entire adult life being told his instincts are sound and his judgment is worth trusting. Tina Brown's line about him, absolutely terrible taste in people, and having absolutely no clue who he is, finds its fullest expression in those 49 minutes of television. A statement from Buckingham Palace followed on November 20, 2019, announcing he was suspending his public duties for the foreseeable future, with the consent of Queen Elizabeth II. The palace spent 3 decades managing Andrew's liabilities one at a time: the tabloid coverage, the diplomatic embarrassments, the Epstein photographs, the lawsuits. Each management exercise treated the problem as isolated, addressable, containable. The never complain, never explain doctrine that governs royal public communications isn't inherently corrupt. It's a philosophy built on the reasonable assumption that most royal controversies are temporary. Applied to Andrew, it became something else, a structure for sustained institutional dishonesty. Official trade reports filed with the Foreign Office that bore no relationship to what diplomats actually witnessed. Palace press statements that categorically denied what the civil courts later compelled him to settle. A Christmas Eve email forwarded to a convicted sex offender sitting in a sealed DOJ file, waiting. After Giuffre filed her civil suit in August 2021, the institution's instinct was still to fight, to treat the lawsuit as a PR problem rather than a reckoning. It took a judge refusing to dismiss the case and the British military formally requesting its titles back before the palace moved. Even then, the settlement was structured partly through royal funds. The institution that created the problem contributed to paying it off. When the DOJ files were released in January 2026, millions of documents, Andrew's name appeared in contexts that transformed the Epstein story from a personal scandal into a national security question. The emails forwarding confidential briefings on Afghanistan and Asia, the November 2010 itinerary sent to Epstein detailing travel plans across Vietnam, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the Christmas Eve message about Helmand Province. These weren't the actions of a naive man who kept bad company. They were the actions of a man who had been given official government access, official cover, and official diplomatic infrastructure, and who had been using all of it in ways the Foreign Office couldn't acknowledge publicly and wouldn't disclose for another 54 years. An anti-royal organization formally called for a police investigation after the files surfaced. The Metropolitan Police arrested Andrew on February 19, 2026. His siblings issued no public statement that day. The palace said nothing. In October 2025, when Andrew was stripped of his remaining honors, the peerage title of Duke of York, his birth title of Prince, Giuffre's siblings released a statement. At last today, our broken hearts have been lifted at the news that no one is above the law, not even royalty. Virginia Giuffre, who had spent years bringing her case through courts on 2 continents, had died by suicide before the arrest. She didn't see the handcuffs. Every person who wrote a glowing diplomatic report they didn't believe. Every courtier who decided that raising concerns about Andrew's associations wasn't worth the career risk. Every senior official who stood in a room while the Queen was told to strip her son of his titles and felt relieved it was finally, quietly, over. All of them contributed to what happened on a birthday morning in February 2026. The palace didn't just protect Andrew from consequences. It protected him until he became one. If you want more investigative breakdowns of the institutions that shape modern history, subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from.